Hi, I'm Seth Miller-Gabriel. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Programs with AIAI, which is the Association for the Improvement of American Infrastructure. If you like what you hear today and want to help us improve American infrastructure through innovative project delivery, please look us up at our website, www.aiai-infra.org. That's aiai-infra.org. Or look me up on LinkedIn or anywhere else. It's Seth Miller-Gabriel. Thank you very much. So here today to talk about public-private partnerships, innovative project delivery. There's a lot of different things within there for water, wastewater, but really all infrastructure classes. Because throughout my experience being an advisor on P3s or government person active in public-private partnerships and infrastructure in general, you realize pretty quickly, and you all know this, one infrastructure class is not listed independently. I've never worked on a building project that doesn't have a road going to it. I've never worked on a road that goes to nothing. Well, once in Alaska, that's a long story, but really goes somewhere. I've never worked on a water and wastewater project that wasn't attached to something else. So all these different walls we build between the asset classes are just kind of human constructs we put there, which honestly, for really being honest, are a little silly because it's all connected. You need to have one functioning infrastructure project and system for it all to work. And the best way to do that, I think, is through real partnerships. So there's my boring bio. You don't need to know any more about that. So public-private partnerships, where are they? As I said, as Mike said on the outset, I feel bad. Sorry, I'm going to move over here. I'll move around a lot. I can't stay still, or I'll fall over. P3s have grown everywhere. When I started in public-private partnerships over 12 years ago, we had very few states that were doing public-private partnerships, or what we call P3s. I started out with a group at KPMG Corporate Finance Group. Their idea was they sent a bunch of Brits over to the US. They were going to get the federal government to pass P3 legislation, and boom, they were going to recolonize us through better procurement. I sent my application into this through my professor, so all the students in the room. This is a great thing. It's meeting with this huge partner from the UK who has since retired, he's a knight now, legitimately. And he spends his vacations on submarines, because when you know the Queen that well, you just get to take a submarine now. It's not a bad job. So he came, explained this to my professor. As he left, my professor turned to me and said, you need to send in your resume. This guy's going to try to get P3 passed at the federal level. He's going to go to Austin, Texas, and he's going to get shot. And so I did, and I got a call from Austin, Texas. They said, our boss told us to talk to you. When can you come down? And that started my career in P3. So never underestimate just sending your resume to random people. Started out in Texas. Texas, as many of you know, if you work there, did a lot of toll roads through public-private partnerships. Very active. And then they decided they didn't like tolling, so they stopped. And then they decided they liked tolling again, so they started again. Now they decided they didn't. Not a good business model to attract the private sector. You gotta really stick with it. But this model has grown everywhere. A lot of states we need to work on. A lot of places have very different ways they look at public-private partnerships. So start out, as I said, toll roads. That makes sense to a lot of Americans. If I use this highway, I might be willing to pay a toll. You transfer the tax or the fee for that road to the people using it, not the general population. And it really helps to make sure that that road is maintained appropriately through the life of the road. That model worked really, really well until the economic crash, when all the traffic and revenue models failed, because no one really expected there'd be less truck traffic on the Indiana toll road 1 year to the next. And then 1 year there was less traffic on the toll road. So if you Google public-private partnerships, one of the first things you might see would be Indiana toll road was a total failure. Well, I'll tell you today, it wasn't. The companies that took over that road and paid Indiana I think it's $3.8 billion, maybe a little off. That organization went bankrupt and had to restructure. So you can say that part's a failure. From the standpoint of Indiana, it wasn't a failure because they still had their $3.8 billion, which they used for other projects, and the road kept functioning. So if you look at it just as an investment standpoint, if that model is off, if your traffic and revenue numbers are off, or your throughput for water, wastewater is off, if you have a private partner who's put up their own equity in the project, it's the private partner's equity that's at risk. And that's what they do. And if any of you are private equity investors in here, thank you very much. You take a lot of risk for a lot of return, but when things go wrong, that's the person on the hook, not the public. So I always like to start with people ask, what is a public-private partnership? And I like to first start with what it's not, and that's the misconceptions. So it's not privatization. I've never have been, never will be in the business of privatizing anything. That is not a partnership. There's no interaction there. That is a government at whatever level selling some asset to a private operator, and then in typical DC fashion, we then regulate the hell out of it until it failed. That's what we would do. We're not about that. We're looking to have strong partnerships where we're all working together. It is not a funding solution. Public-private partnerships or innovative project delivery is just, in most cases, a financing tool. It is not funding. There's two different things. Funding is money coming from somewhere, either tax revenues at some level or some sort of other revenue or user fee. That's money coming in that goes to the project. Financing is just like getting a mortgage or your credit card or any other kind of debt instrument that you might use personally. It is not money coming in. Your credit card does not give you money. It's debt. It's just a financing tool. These are just different financing tools. They are not low quality delivery model. We always like this. So public-private partnerships are rooted in this idea that it's performance-based. If you are on the private side of a public-private partnership, your mission is make sure that that project performs. Because if it doesn't perform, you don't get paid. You either don't get paid from the government through an availability payment, which we'll talk about later, or you don't get paid from users because no one's going to go on your toll road if it's a terrible road. So your mission is to make sure that that asset, whether it's a water or wastewater system, or it's a toll road, whether it's a building, is performing at a level that people want to use it, and you fulfilled the terms of your contract. And it's not the right solution for every project. We get into some of the minimums of how big a P3 really has to be for different asset classes, but everything's not going to be a perfect fit for a public-private partnership. I've heard all sorts of estimates, but if in the United States we got to 10% of all projects done under a partnership, that would be amazing. That would be the high end. A lot of projects and a lot of things are still done inherently best when governments do it themselves. Which, are there any government people in here? Okay, good, so I'll be honest with you. So, the thing of this myth that government does something itself, we all know that's not really true. I mean, show me a state DOT that's ever designed, built, operated a road. Show me a water system that's ever designed, built, operated everything in their water system. They don't do, there's always a private sector component. So this idea that government does it versus it ever be a partnership, I've never seen that exist anyway. So, it's not that. So what is a P3? The upside. It is just a better way to design, construct, finance, operate, and maintain something. So it's the public sector taking a hard look at everything they do and saying, you know what, our traditional model of doing this procurement where we pay someone to design something, we take that design, we go out to bid to build it, we build it. In my experience within government, we tend to screw that up because then we have change orders because we can't make up our mind and things move, and a lot of the overruns and delays are not really on the private side, it's government causing a lot of problems. Then government finance it through traditional models. So again, not funding, all the funding still comes from the taxpayers. The financing comes from issuance of some sort of government debt, whether it's general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, it's still debt. And then this is where it really falls down. In a lot of my experience with governments, it's on that operation and maintenance. Every elected official loves to cut a ribbon on a new project. If you're expanding a water or sewer project, they want to be right there. But when you have to go to them every year for a budget season and say, okay, I need money now to maintain that, well, then they really don't want to talk to you. There's no constituency here for proper maintenance. Americans inherently don't get excited about spending tax dollars on maintaining things we have. We get very excited about new stuff, less excited about maintaining things. And that's where the traditional quote-unquote model falls down. I can tell you in DC, we are either blessed or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with an unlimited supply of poorly maintained public facilities. There is not one building that the government owns that has been properly maintained. There are plenty of buildings that the government rents at absurd rates that are properly maintained. And you probably have all experienced this, where the worst result of that is, you're in a situation where I was working on a project where we were trying to do a P3 for our police headquarters. 600,000 square foot building, built in 1940, had not been maintained appropriately since 1940. We couldn't use about 500 square feet of that building because it could not be inhabited by human beings. The chief of police office in a major city would be flooded regularly. And for any of you engineers, you only know there's two kinds of water inside a building. And I'd let you guess which kind would flood his office. So the idea of doing a P3 through this design, construction, finance was very attractive. The pushback we always got was, well, we could just vacate that building, we could rent space cheaper. Well, you could, and they do a lot, and most cities and states do this a lot. But how terrible a situation is that? That the public can own hundreds of thousands of square feet of unusable buildings that are just sitting there boarded up. And then spend your tax dollars, not only to keep those buildings standing, but then spend your tax dollars to rent other space. The economics of this make no sense at all. But that's where we are now, because we don't want to maintain a lot of facilities. So how do we get this better performance? It's through risk sharing. So we've done a lot of research at AIAI, and we're doing even more. And I'd love to talk to any of you about this, that experience. How to appropriately transfer risk. So the big thing when you're partnering for you with a government is making sure if you're going to have a contract, a long-term contract, that you are looking at risk the same way you look as money. You need to start monetizing risk. Every risk has a cost to mitigate. And so every risk, and this is a fun exercise I got to do with my highly paid consultants for 2 days, where you lock yourself in the room and you do a risk registry. Go through everything that could possibly go wrong with this project. And in DC it was down to zombie apocalypse, the federal government abandoning the city, the federal government nationalizing the city, and the fact that if we have a building that we're asking contractors to maintain, if they can't get to that building, who's responsible for it? And then you take all those risks and you start to divide up who is best able to manage that risk. Is it the public sector or the private sector? And once you determine that, that's when you transfer the risk to the right partner. And they are now responsible, whether through performance or insurance or other means, to manage that risk. And if you do it right, the cost goes down for everyone. Because risk is where the cost is. That's what we're about. If something breaks in a water system, who's on the hook for that? So it goes into that risk, it goes into the lifecycle procurement approach. One of the most painful things I've ever done is try to explain to a city council person how much a building actually costs to own through its life. They're very used to just looking at the sticker price. We can afford that building or new water treatment plant. We have that room in our capital budget. Well, great. Do you have the room in your capital budget for the next 30, 40, 50 years to maintain it? Well, I don't know. I get elected next year, so I don't care. And that's normally the response. But it's like buying a really expensive sports car and not being able to afford the oil changes after that. Bad things happen. So we're very good in this country buying really expensive water systems that are sports cars, and then we don't change the oil. And then we get really mad when it falls apart. Oh, you didn't change the oil. That's why it's now sitting on the side of the road. Under this model, and whether you call it P3 or however you want to say it, it's just forcing the government, really all of us, to look at the things that we're buying and determining if can we afford to maintain it? Can we actually afford what it is? And those get to be really big, scary numbers. So that building I was telling you about, the District of Columbia had spent maybe $5 million a year maintaining, which was not nearly enough. When we came back and said, all right, we have a great deal for you. The private sector is willing to take this on. They're going to come in. They're going to rebuild the inside because it's historic, like everything in D.C. You can't knock anything down. Rebuild the inside, finance it, and maintain it for the next 30 years. And for that deal, it's only going to cost the district $30 million a year. We've never spent $30 million a year in that building. Well, it's pretty obvious you've never spent $30 million a year on that building. That's why it's in such bad shape. But that's how much that building actually costs. So it's forcing elected officials, or sometimes appointed officials, and ourselves to realize the true life cycle cost of something. How much is this going to cost through its life? And it's amazing that we found, working with engineering firms, and all of you are engineers know this, if you actually maintain what you're building, it tends to last longer. And your cost of maintenance can actually go down because appropriate design and construction and early maintenance saves you a lot more money later on. The worst thing you can do is skip that first maintenance because then everything else is more expensive. So that gets into the transparent relationship. These partnerships are all just about working together, and they're really partnerships. One of the most frustrating things, and I've talked about P3s throughout the world. If any of you want to, if any of you have been to Albania, it's a fantastic country. Go, it's great. I only was near one shootout. It was fine. But even in places like that, they even have a culture very different than ourselves. It's amazing how in the United States the relationship between the government, pick whatever level government, and the private sector, their contractors, is almost in conflict. There's almost this feeling of when you go into a contract negotiations to build anything, the government feels that you, the private sector, you're out to get them. Somehow you're out to get them. You're going to make super profits as a starter. And then let's admit, from the private side, you look at the government and say, this guy is here trying to lowball me and just has some other agenda. I don't know why we're like that. I don't know where this culture came from. But through these partnerships, we're trying to change that. It needs to be this transparent alignment of not just the risk, but the goals. We all want a functioning water wastewater system. It's in everyone's interest for it to work everywhere. So let's just start from there, accept that that is our mutual goal, and start working forward. And that's the relationship. So P3s, I always like to joke, and sometimes I get in trouble, a public-private partnership is just a marriage. If you start out in a marriage thinking that your partner is out to get you somehow, that's not gonna work. You need to align goals. If you start out in marriage and one partner is fully set that you're gonna have 4 children and the other one is not, you're gonna have a problem. You need to be very upfront and honest and put that all in the contract. And then my other joke is know that you understand that contract, because my wife, in her culture, you have marriage contracts. It's written in Hebrew, which I do not read. And so she likes to point at and say, well, you signed this contract, so you have to take out the trash. So make sure you know what contract you're reading before you sign it. But this is how the marriage works. And you're really in a marriage. If you are going to work on a P3 in a water wastewater system, you don't put those pipes in the ground for 5 years or 10 years. They're in there for 30, 40, 50. Where I live, sometimes the pipes have been there since the Civil War, which caused some problems. Things, it's long term, so you gotta start thinking long term. These are the important considerations. The public agency is not gonna lose control. Really, they're not, because we're not privatizing anything. If anything, the public agency actually gains more control, because now there's a contractual relationship that outlines what everyone's doing. Everyone knows what they should be doing, and if they do it, they're better off. Like I said, not every project is suitable for a P3. If you have a $500,000 project somewhere, don't do a P3 for it. First one, tell you. Even if you have a $10 million project somewhere, you probably shouldn't do a P3 because you're going to spend that much money hiring lawyers. Not a lawyer. I don't know if anyone's a lawyer. If you are, I'm sorry. Lawyers are great. They're also very expensive. You spend a lot of money on advisors on this. They're not free money. It's not the private sector. As fantastic and benevolent as you all are, you're not showing up with free money for the public. Say, here you go, we're going to build this. You expect to be paid back. You expect to make a profit on it. You're not going to take your poorly conceived project and it's not magically going to work. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to advise governments and they say, this project is terrible, we've really messed it up, we have no money, let's do a P3. Like, no, the only people who win in that scenario are the lawyers who are going to advise you on it until you give up. If it's a bad project, it's a bad project. Very simple. And they are not inexpensive. I can tell you, we spend an awful lot of money in DC and everywhere I've worked on financial advisors, technical advisors, and legal advisors. So getting to why those are all folks you really do need, and they're very helpful on both sides of the ledger, but they're not cheap. And you kind of get what you pay for. So hiring the cheapest advisor is not always the best option. But it's not an easy way to go. It's not a cheap way to go, so make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. So here's the structure. This is super simple. My 7-year-old daughter is actually writing a child's guide to P3s in the world, starting out with the basis of what's the difference between a need and a want. We're going to send this to Congress and see if we get anywhere with it. But the poor child, it's probably a view she can draw this chart, and this is a very simple P3 chart. It is actually very simple at left, but the top side, agency, that is government. That is the owner of the asset. Nothing changes on that. And what you have coming down that concession agreement is simply the contract between the government and the special purpose vehicle, or the consortium or team, whatever you want to call it. There's only one contract government signs in these deals. Is one contract with that consortium. That really helps the government because within that consortium, when they're going through the procurement, they know who's on the team. They know the players, they know who's putting in money, they know who's building stuff. They can select based on, as we heard earlier, that relationship. Who do they trust in your experience? That one contract. That special purpose vehicle is normally in a lot of places an LLC formed for just that project. And really all it does is hold other contractual agreements and debt. So the company exists. Normally they have very few employees because they go back to the parent companies, but they're also the ones that get yelled at in the press. There's a small light rail project going on in Maryland near the district. I had lunch with the poor gentleman who is the CEO of that special purpose company. It was 11 a.m. We didn't drink, but we really thought about it because he's the one that gets yelled at all the time in the newspaper. That's kind of his job. So that project, special purpose vehicle company has relationships with the sponsors, so your design firms, your construction firms, your O&M firms. They are all party to this. They all have some either ownership stake or other agreement into this, so they are invested. Now, before you get too worried, it's non-recourse investment most times. So if that special purpose vehicle company, for some reason something goes south and they go bankrupt, it's not as if it's going to come back to your company, but you have to set that up correctly to do it. I'm not saying you won't lose money. I can't guarantee that, but it's a different situation. These things are financed through a mixture of debt and equity. So instead of the government issuing $300 million of general obligation bonds for a very large project, you have private firms going to the bank, these banks, and there's plenty of people who will issue debt, and you'll find an equity partner who will put 10% is normally good into a project. Why do you want that 10%? I'll tell you, there's good and bad of equity. Equity is great because those equity partners, it's their real money. It's not just someone else's money. And it's amazing how you act differently when it's your money versus someone else's money in a debt situation. So that money is at risk.
Seth?
Yes?
Are those people different from the contractors?
Sometimes they can be the contractors.
Yeah.
So if you work for a I'll say very large contractor, I've seen where contractors put up their own balance sheet and invest in it, which is, by the way, a great situation because now from the government side, you have two hooks into that contractor. They're very invested. And that thing I said about non-recourse financing, that's out the window. Now it's very much recourse financing. So they're connected.
Is 90-10 a pretty standard?
That gets become pretty standard. And the reason you don't want to get much past that, and there's some places where it's much higher, and it depends on the deal, and some places much lower, equity is expensive. So if you are the equity partner, whether you're a contractor or you're an equity fund putting money in, that money is at risk. And you are the last person to get paid. You're at the bottom of the cash waterfall. You know, everyone else gets paid first, and then you get paid. So your risk is much higher, meaning your expected return is much higher than on debt, because you are taking that risk, which is great. Meaning that if you are the equity partner in this, you are so invested in this project, it becomes your mission to make sure the project is successful, which is great for government, because government's not so good at enforcing that, you know, they'll put penalties and they'll come after you. But when it really comes down to, oh, this project's going to fail or not, how do we get in there? Not so good. The equity partner is much better because they've lived through that project, they've lived through the design, they're going to be there, they're going to make sure things work. And hopefully, if they're really good at it, they'll fix any problems before government notices it. So they're involved. That equity, by the way, that is the money you burn through during design and construction phase. That's the money that goes first. And so you rely on that. So then that special purpose vehicle will have separate agreements down to the O&M contractor. Now they could be in situations where I've seen the design, construction, and operation maintenance firms are all part owners of the SPV, like real equity they put in. They still have separate contracts back to themselves to dictate the terms, which makes that a good marriage with inside the special purpose vehicle because then all those partners have some obligation to each other. I worked very early in my career on express toll lanes in Virginia. So if you've ever been on the Beltway around DC, I'm sorry. But the express toll lanes work very well. I take them even if I don't need to because, well, that was a good year, so I support it. But that contract term, we had a several hundred-page contractual agreement between the Commonwealth of Virginia and the special purpose vehicle, and then we had a several thousand-page contract term between the special purpose vehicle and different parties for design, construction, and O&M. They were the same companies that owned the special purpose vehicle, but they contracted themselves back in, and it's worked really well. The obligation was understood; people knew what they're doing.
But it's a contract, not an entity.
Well, the special purpose vehicle is an entity.
It is an entity.
It is an entity.
Okay.
It's a legal entity. The reason you do that is because then the government has a contract with that one entity.
Right, okay.
Now, depending on the nature of the relationship, the different partners could be very involved or less involved. I've seen entities where they have a design partner, they do the design, everyone's happy, and then they're less involved, or they're not involved at all. Just depends on the nature of the project. All right, so getting back to what is a P3, and sorry, our color scheme's not great, but I don't control that, and I'm afraid of our communications person, so I don't tell her anything. But in here just shows where we are in the thing, and I'll kind of point it. So over on the far side there is your more traditional design, bid, build. You know, design separate from bid, you bid that out, you build it, and then you hopefully maintain it. Then you get to some of the stuff many of you are probably familiar with, a construction manager. You start to get some manager at risk. You get into design build, which a lot of states have design build. It's done a lot of good. You get into design build finance, where the government's now asking the private sector to finance that design and construction, and then they're paid back at completion, or some partial completion. And you know what really I was talking a lot more about with design, build, operate, maintain. Those next two, between that and the design, build, finance, operate, maintain through availability, payment, or revenue risk, the difference between those three is the one further over. There's been a lot of agreements and partnerships where the public sector finds it, let's be honest, just cheaper to finance the project themselves. They say, once they do the financial analysis, they say, all right, we can still issue debt. We want everything except for the equity component, essentially. So they issue debt and they do it themselves. Or in some situations, they have the equity. When you do projects in Saudi Arabia and Dubai, places like that, it's amazing. When the king decides he wants something, he just kind of sends money and it happens. So that's, you know, we don't have that situation. We don't have that kind of money. It works out. So as you get further over, those other two, that's when you have the financing component come in. And I'll explain the difference between those in a moment, but the further off is privatization. It's a whole different deal. The difference between availability payment and revenue, we're still talking about. Well, one, pretty simple, availability payment is just payment from the government, the owner, if the asset is available to you. So is the water flowing? Is everything being treated? Is the road open? Is the building functioning? That payment's made. That allows the government to then control that payment. If something is not working the way it should be, the payment can be delayed, it can be cut down, or it can be canceled for that month or quarter or year. That's when the equity folks get really upset. They don't like that. For a revenue risk, that is more your traditional toll road model, where the government says, all right, you want the Indiana toll road, that's your business, we're not going to pay you anything, you make your money on the toll. So the government's out of that. So what sectors work for public-private partnerships? Put in there. So we do have water, utilities, energy generation, telecommunications. Here, that's not so true. A lot of places in the world, they're still going through a process of deregulating telecommunications. Healthcare has come up an awful lot. If you ever get to go, which I did, go to Canada to tour hospitals, they're pretty phenomenal. Beyond whatever you think of the healthcare system there, most, if not all, of their healthcare facilities, the hospitals, are done under public-private partnership now. So the provincial government will say, hey, private sector, build us a hospital, maintain it, make sure it works. We'll provide all the healthcare inside. We just want to building systems that work. The fantastic one outside of Toronto, they have robots that deliver supplies throughout the building. I believe it's Johnson Controls manages from a basement. They have a screen where you see the robots going on different elevators. They look like just carts. And they warn you when they're coming. And of course, in typical Canadian fashion, if you get in its way, it stops and it apologizes to you. So if anyone's Canadian. But it's very nice. But those are the kind of innovations where the private sector made this determination that they could lower costs over time. They have robotic delivery of equipment and other supplies. And it's worked out for them. So they live within the confines of that availability. So healthcare is coming up. Fire, police stations. It's really interesting in a lot of places now throughout the world, and we're trying to bring it here to the U.S. You look at police and fire stations. Doing just one is not normally economically viable. They tend to be too small. But if you bundle them together, which when Kansas does get legislation, I'd love to help encourage you to do this. Bundling a smaller project gets you to the economic threshold and lowers your per unit cost. So instead of building one fire station for $20 million, you do 5 of them. And your per unit, your per station cost goes down. Because now you're building 5 fire stations simultaneously. They can all look the same, which helps with people identifying them. For the operation and maintenance side, you really start to cut costs and bring in efficiency. Because now instead of having one person and one truck to maintain one fire station, you have one person and one truck to maintain 5 fire stations. This worked really well in the province in Alberta, in Canada. They replaced all their police stations at once. It was only about 12, not that many people were there. But their per unit cost is much lower, and their operation maintenance cost is much lower because they bought a few dozen prefabricated police stations that all look the same. They're taken out, put down. It's all standardized. So now if something goes wrong with the heating system in one, they know what all of them.
Just quickly before you get off that, but I can see the efficiency in that, but I can also expect the criticisms on the political side that you're giving too much to one entity, or from this group here, we're saying, hey, we all want a piece of that.
Absolutely. Well, the great thing on that is that you could put in contracts, I'm seeing this, that you could have one master development contract. And I'm not saying a whole state would do all their police stations.
Right.
This would be very, probably one county. If you got bigger than that, you say, all right, you know it's unrealistic to do this all in one shot. And I'll give you an example. So in Pennsylvania, they've done this with their bridges. They're going to replace or repair 800 bridges through the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Instead of they have one master contract, they have some design and localized, but they know that throughout Pennsylvania, you couldn't have one construction firm do all of it, which is physically impossible to do. And so within the confines of that master development agreement, you have these sub-agreements for construction design regionally. You still get the efficiency from the state side because you've covered this and you know the payment how it works. But from spreading out the economics of it and making sure you're actually having people on the ground, you have to have this. So that's a good point. And when I say bundle, in Canada it's a little bit different here. I couldn't see a whole state doing all the police stations. That would just it's not even how we purchase things. But you could think within one city or one county, you could potentially do that. And then you're going to have to deal with a realistic situation on the ground. You have one firm that could do it. One cautionary tale on correction facilities. I started out early in DC. We desperately needed to replace the jail in DC. Side note, do not go to jail in DC. It is terrible. I got to tour it. It was probably one of those frightening things ever in my life. I was with the warden and they still had to like move people around. Trying to say you're going to do something innovative with corrections is kind of the hot stove. So like, hey, this is great. Everyone knows we need something. We figured the advocates for prisoners were like, yes, we know it's terrible. And in DC, it's only if you commit a more minor crime, less than a year, do you stay there. Because we're a federal enclave, if you commit a felony, you get shipped off to places like Kansas for a longer period of time. But we said, hey, we want to help it. We want to improve the conditions. The roof leaks, the heating, the air conditioning don't work. We're going to fix this through a P3. And the story the next day through an op-ed in the Washington Post was that I had a secret plan to privatize a prison. I begged the mayor to let me write a response being like, I don't have a secret plan, but if you have a secret plan, please let me know, because it's probably better than the plan I have. So corrections are difficult. The traditional toll roads, airports thing, that's what we have with airports. Is actually any of you involved in airports? I think that's one of the growing markets. If you travel internationally, you realize our airports are not great. And I think one of the reasons why our airports are not great, generally they're owned by cities or counties. And unfortunately, cities or counties haven't realized that airports are just shopping malls where we trap people. The Europeans have figured this out. If you go to small airports in Europe, it's one giant duty-free shop. And if you're there for more than an hour, you just start buying things because there's nothing else going on. We could do that here. I mean, airports, if we had the ability where that county can make a deal with a private entity who could design and build an airport, redesign it, to maximize the shopping throughput, you would see the revenue go up. If you ever go through Heathrow, it's amazing. They don't tell you where your gate is to the last possible minute because they want you to buy another beer in the cheesy, fake British pub in Heathrow. But that's where the money comes from. So airports the way to go. Municipality, the same thing. Education, we're seeing a huge uptick in universities reaching out to us in industry. Universities, again, public institutions in particular, have suffered from the lack of maintenance funding from the state or the region. It's just not their core mission. Even if they had the money, a lot of them are too small to hire the staff they need to manage that kind of project. And so we're hearing from a lot of universities that want to engage the private sector, especially on those assets that have revenue coming through. So parking and dormitories. I'll go out and make a prediction that in the next 10 to 20 years, almost all universities will have some sort of partnership for parking and dormitories. They'll be out of that business totally. And you'll have companies that manage parking and manage accommodation for people living, doing all that work. And we've had situations where universities who really need the revenue, because a lot of times they have a dormitory, and to the students, you might know this, but you pay to live in the dorm. The college gets the money for you to pay there, and unfortunately, a lot of times they don't maintain the dorm you live in, and so it's not great. But for them to turn over all that revenue to the private sector is hard on their budget because they're used to that money coming in. So structuring that financially so the university still gets some of that revenue or some sort of revenue coming in, but the dormitory can be maintained appropriately for you. I would see that coming through. And of course, in water and wastewater, the U.S. has a very unique system compared to our global partners, a mix of publicly owned, privately operated, sometimes it's publicly operated systems that are either owned by city or county. If any of you work in Texas, it was made clear to me the water districts are somewhere above God in the scheme of authority. And so you have different authorities and different levels of ability to partner. But that is another asset, probably more than anything, that you're looking at what you have in the ground. And you all know more maintenance needs to be done. That's going to be probably the hardest argument to be made to a lot of elected officials, because you put the pipes in the ground, they don't see it. And so when you say, hey, we need $100 million to maintain everything or bad things are going to happen, well, I don't see a problem. Well, you know, of course, it's on the ground, but no offense to aspiring elected officials.
A question for you in terms of Kansas being a small state, and a lot of our smaller communities are struggling with their water, wastewater, and knowing that you have these big Canadian and Australian financing companies that are looking for X amount of dollars before they'll even look at things. Are there some things happening around the country similar to Kansas to where these small cities and counties are working together to cluster collectively what they're doing in terms of one city's got X amount of dollars for infrastructure improvements and another one joins in to grow that number enough to make it attractive enough for these big financing companies?
We're starting to see that. It hasn't taken off the way I hoped. I always joke, I've said for the past 10 years that water and wastewater is the future of partnerships, and it's still the future. It's kind of like a Disney World ride where like, this is the future. But yeah, that's where we're going to go, and that's probably the best way it's going to happen. The only way it's going to happen is that you'll have a bundling of projects, and not necessarily authority. We're not going to consolidate the number of water or wastewater districts, but could you have a situation in a state like Kansas where maybe you have a state for office that's helping to facilitate that happening, where they can help some of these smaller water wastewater districts work together, identify their needs, and then that office at the state level could help structure a deal where they would attract those global partners or national partners from the financing side and expertise side to bundle those projects together. So you still have one contract, but again, you have the regional players working on those projects with the expertise coming in, and especially the financing coming in.
And that's where I think AGC of Kansas and its members want to have an opportunity to work with AIAI to maybe approach our public entities on a statewide basis, and then pull together some regional communities to talk about that, because I think we can accelerate opportunities for design and construction. If we were to introduce that, I know 5 years ago, the city of Wichita, the water spigot turned off by Mother Nature, and we brought together, several people in this room were brought to the table to meet the CEO of the city of Wichita to look at innovative financing with possible P3s, and opened their eyes. Unfortunately enough, 2 or 3 months later, Mother Nature turned the spigot back on, and the water issue went away, although it's still in front of us. But the fact was, the city said we had no idea. And it was a construction design committee that brought those ideas to the table. So I know Wichita considers itself, like over in the Kansas City metro area, to be very sophisticated, but they weren't very sophisticated. Now, if we drill down and go to Garden City or Eureka or Hayes, they're going to be even less sophisticated. So it would be incumbent on the construction design community, ACEC, AIAI, to work with you guys to be able to introduce that to certain communities.
That'd be great. That's why we're here. Any way we can help.
Seth, I've got a question, and you may be heading in this direction, and this may be naive, but I'm looking at all of that list, and I'm looking at all that's going on in our community and in our state, and all of it. I mean, there's like 8 things that are just staring at us right now. And I go back, and you're saying that there is no P3 authority in the state of Kansas. So the Wichita State growth is, is it a P3? Is it not a P3? I guess I'm just not educated enough to know where we are and what needs to happen in the state of Kansas for us to be placed with Texas and Oklahoma as broadly enabled.
I'll answer that question. Again, Wichita State, KU, K-State, a couple other universities are using some type of quasi P3, but because there's not some guidelines and some statutes. Now, we are having those discussions, as I said at the beginning of this meeting. We're having some early discussions because the Kansas Board of Regents that oversees those institutions have some ideas of what they would want to do. They've asked AGC of Kansas to be their sole partner in refining that language. Now, our Board of Directors have discussed this. We're concerned that we don't want to get too stringent on some of the guidelines in this thing because we want to have flexibility in what we're dealing with. And Kansas Board of Regents staff and president who met with our leadership last year on this very subject matter agree that we want to keep this broad in nature in the initial language, but we're moving in that direction because what we want to have is some specific guidelines that everybody knows what the rules of the game are, because right now, from the industry standpoint, depending on what side of the fence you are on these issues, a lot of people don't know what the rules of the game are. And if you take that from a university and now translate it down to water, wastewater, and some other of the deliverables, we've got to make sure that the politicians clearly understand that we need to put some meat on the bones on that. So AGC, I will say, and this isn't a paid political announcement, AGC of Kansas proactively jumped in front of this thing because of some projects, some major dollar projects that took place at Wichita State, KU, and K-State, and felt like that it was time, for a better word, to reel it back in. And so we had a face-to-face with the Kansas Board of Regents and are beginning to put that meat on the bones and be prepared to put some legislation in front of the policymakers of it to be.
But hasn't precedence already taken place with all these other states that are enabling these?
There are, and that's what we're using some of the models, and we're working with AIAI on this to see what, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Kansas has its own unique needs, wants, and desires. So we want to make sure that whatever we take in best practices, and that's why we're attending their conferences to interact with the other states to see what's working well for their state, but take the best of what they're doing because we consider them the guinea pigs, and then we can refine it and adapt it to what fits Kansas. Jim, you can expand on that?
Yeah, just quickly, I think the fact is there's no limiting legislation for what's happened at KU or K-State or Wichita State in those areas right now. But there's been objections to it, and there eventually will be limiting legislation if it's not there now. And we see that as an opportunity for us to get out and try to make enabling legislation that provides guidelines instead of people coming out and just saying, no, we're not going to do P3 in Kansas.
And we feel as an industry that the policymakers need to have, and the entities need to have this other tool in their toolbox. Because obviously, one thing that got my attention 2 years ago in going to the AIAI conference in Dallas, I was just impressed with the cross-section of university officials that were there, but all of them had a common message. Our state has no money, and we have got to find ways to do it. I will suggest to you, everybody in this room has talked to a city or a county about there's no money for water or wastewater unless we do some massive tax increase, of which the constituents in their community are not going to go for. So why not bring this other tool, the toolbox, for them to look at in a creative manner for some innovative financing. And I will say too, the ones that are concerned that the big firms are going to come in here and gobble everything up, We have a live example, and I don't want to share with you because it'll come out here not too recent, but we have a live example right here in Wichita to where all politics is local, and AGC inflects its muscle on a key issue to where we demonstrated the policymakers that there was the expertise to do the work, and if you don't turn to give the first and last opportunity to show that expertise, that you're going to lose tax base, you're going to lose employment, and eventually we are losing our younger generation. And that resonated with the politicians, and we're going to continue to carry that message across the state of Kansas with the smallest cities, the largest cities, and the universities and other municipalities that are out there.
And when you say the institutions, you're talking about the lenders?
I'm talking about the institutions like Kansas State, Wichita State,
okay.
the decision makers who are going to choose who they have as design professionals and contractors
Right.
on projects. In my opinion, there's nothing in this state that can't be done with Kansas companies.
Right.
Nothing. And if there is, there's no reason why that outside entity should be joint venturing with local firms. But we have to protect this small state and keep our younger generation, keep our tax base here. And that tax base is going to go into supporting these public-private partnerships for sustained funding and future financing for other projects.
Thank you.
The two things that I've seen and worked in states that have done P3s without enabling legislation, because like your point, no one told them no. And then there's plenty of states that have enabling legislation that have never done a P3. And so just figuring out, are you going to do it or not?
And that point right there is why we don't want to get too stringent with the language, because of what Jim Renner just said, that if we get too tight, it may support somebody that says, well, that is going to actually cut off any opportunities. So there's got to be a happy medium there.
And just open it. And the only upside or push for enabling legislation, broad enabling legislation, is that limits some political risk, takes that away. So firms either in the state or outside the state coming in, engaging in a P3, you're a little more comfortable if you have a law saying you can do it, and not just saying, well, we don't have a law that says we can't. And that risk, because I start off, and that risk has a cost. So if you feel, well, you don't have, no one's telling you no, but we're going to do it anyway. I mean, well, maybe I'll add a few percentage points to this deal because I'm a little nervous that something's not going to work. And you're exactly right, Mike. With the exception of one place, if you have foreign or other states coming in to work on projects, they do not come in with thousands of employees. So there's a company called Skanska that did a lot of P3s for buildings in and around there. They did not bring thousands of people from Sweden to work on the project. They might have brought a project manager and they brought financing. So if nothing else, you're bringing in money from outside to work on a project, which is a good thing. You bring money into the local economy and a little expertise, but they're going to hire the firms here. They're going to transfer that knowledge of how to do this to the firms here. So you have a net gain on the finance end, you have a net gain on the knowledge transfer end, and then they're not going to bring over people and say, now you live here for the next 30 years, maintain this building. You have a net gain on long-term sustainable jobs at that O&M level,
Right.
which every city likes. They tend to be very good paying jobs. That's a career, not just a job. So that the only exception, if anyone were, the only group I've seen that will bring in all that, do all that, violate that rule, if you do a deal with the Chinese government, they tend to bring in their own people. So when they built their new embassy in the U.S., they brought in 1,000 people. And they all left. No net gain.
Wow.
So I'll get through. So, this works out. So, criteria for a viable P3 project. 1, legislation. Can you do this? Or can you not do this? And then we've been highlighting a lot. Just because you have P3 legislation, make sure that everything else allows you to do it. So I've worked in places, including DC, where we have legislation says, absolutely go ahead, do a P3. You get going, and then you kind of hit a wall where there's some arcane tax code or something, and then you have to go back to the legislators to fix it because something's holding up. So do a real review on that and work with your elected officials. Actually, find the office within the Attorney General's office or the legal advisors to the legislators and work with them because they're the ones that are going to find this. find the project size. I took this down to 50 million. 50 million depends on the bundling, local constraints. It cannot be too much less than that. You're just not going to attract the private equity. Even if it's local private equity, if you are a local pension fund, and that should be highlighted. Most of these equity people that come in, it's not just some billionaire sitting somewhere that decides they want to do infrastructure. By and large, it's pension funds. In a lot of cases, it's public pension funds. I also had some great meetings with union pension funds. So initially people were, oh, the unions must hate this. No, the unions want to invest in this. Why do pension funds want to invest in this? So if you are a pension fund manager, a lot of times you cannot put the money in the stock market. It's too risky. Pretty limited. You used to be able to buy government debt, state and local level, and be great. Well, interest rates have been low for a long time. That's great if you're borrowing money. Really bad if you're trying to buy that debt, like a pension fund. So what do? You can look at real estate, some risk there, or if you're lucky, you can invest in one of these P3 projects. Your rate of return is a lot better than Treasury. Not nearly as risky as the stock market because there's actual asset there. And in the case of a public pension fund or a union, your members may actually be able to work on that project. And so the people working on the project are working to fund their own retirement. So you want to have the right size to attract that investment. So it works that well. Project complexity, P3 should not be the simplest project. They tend to be so large that you want to have some complexity in there. One, I will joke, but it's actually true. It's because you attract the most innovative and interesting people because they want a challenge. Duration and SLA. You don't do P3 for a 2-year project. The real reason why public-private partnerships are all these innovative project delivery that involve private equity and investment go for 20, 30, 40, 50 years is because your private partner makes their money in year 28. That's when equity has a project up and running long enough that they just start getting returns. And you can find this, there's these curves of the return, the money spent and the return, they're inverse. So you spend a lot of money designing and building something, you spend a lot of money making sure it works the first few years, figuring it out, and then your maintenance costs and operation costs tend to go down because you have it functioning. It's when the costs start to go down, that's when equity and everyone else start to make more money. That's when their return is. So they need it to be a bit longer so that it works.
I want you to reemphasize, you brought up the Skanska model.
Yeah, sorry, I don't feel bad in here. I just know.
And you're talking about how the politicians get a little nervous about this, but share in terms of what you've seen in terms of success with the phobia, and that's not negative definition here, but phobia by industry. If I'm a small to medium size, whether it be a general contractor or a specialty contractor or supplier, I don't have a chance to be on a P3 project. Kind of talk about what
Sure.
you've seen around the country in terms of the opportunities versus the phobia that I'm never going to have an opportunity because I don't know that much about P3.
No, that's great. I can do one better, tell you what I did to dispel that and change that, at least within the District of Columbia. So most places, I won't say almost all places, within the legislation, there's always a local or state hiring requirement, so participation. In a lot of states, that it's women, small, disadvantaged business requirements. So in the district, we had a certain percentage that we had to hit as local businesses. That's one, and that's okay. I've seen that go good and bad. What we did is we'd have industry days for these big projects. So you get the international players would come in, and we would make sure, working through our Office of Small Business, if we had to go drag the small businesses in who thought they wouldn't have a chance into these industry days. And halfway through the industry day, we'd run speed dating sessions between larger firms and smaller firms so they could introduce each other. Because we made it very clear to the larger firms, some of them international, some of them domestic, that they needed the local firms. They weren't going to win without the local firms. Such a high percentage of the points within the review of RFP responses are given to having that local participation, that they needed that local firm there. So it became incumbent upon, whether it was an international or national firm, to find the right local partner, and if they had to, invest in training and getting them to the level where they needed to be a good partner in this project. We then would actually go out to the local partners and explain to them first how the project was going to work. And I explained to them not only were they needed, but they were wanted. Because, as I said, a Skanska is not going to come in with 1,000 people from Stockholm and build a project. Not only would it not make any economic sense, but those people wouldn't know what was going on. So we made it very clear there were local firms that did know what was going on. They really did have a chance to do this. And that they really had a chance to partner on this, not just for that small phase, but for the whole life cycle.
So the intent, AGC, AI, and ACEC could be the facilitator,
Yes.
working with those owners and financiers to bring together industry to have those collaborative discussions.
Absolutely. And the best way, the part of a P3 agreement to do this is really in that O&M phase. Because your design and construction phase may be 5 years. Your O&M phase, at least on the toll road I worked on, is 75 years. You're not going to bring generations of people from wherever to do it. So you're going to grow local businesses to do that in the O&M phase. And that's where I think you do the biggest benefit to your regional and local businesses is becoming that partner who's going to maintain this asset for that long. Because I always joked, if I'm a small business somewhere and I get a government contract to build something, and it's just a traditional model, I'll go to the bank and say, I need a small business loan. I just got this 1-year agreement with the city. And they'll be like, that's nice. Come back when you have something interesting. If I go to the bank and say, I need a small business loan, I just signed a 30-year agreement for this P3. Then I'm going to get the loan, and I'm going to grow my business, and I'm going to build capacity locally. And that's what we need to start doing, building capacity locally to do it. I think some of the fear came from that a lot of these firms internationally who've done these big projects came, and they were more afraid that they were not going to find the capacity, the expertise to actually do a lot of this. So we need to dispel that myth on their side, and then we just need to prove them wrong. And there's going to be a lot of communication and work going on.
Well, we think that by our association partnering, and just what we're doing here with collaboration with this conference, that we can project that and dispel some of the phobias that are within the policymakers to realize that we're reinforcing that the talents are here and that we're working in conjunction with the bigger firms to leverage as much resources in the local community.
And early on, one of the biggest fears was that these Australian or Spanish firms were going to come in, build or take over a toll road, and then they'd get bored and leave. And the joke was always, well, are they going to just take the road back to Melbourne? Like, it's still here. It's not, these are hard assets. It's not like they're going to just take it and leave. If the project goes south, they lose their equity, and they might go home, but they've lost money. It was a bad agreement. But we still have the physical asset. And so just having that fear of having other firms come in shouldn't stop us from working together to build better assets.
Are you seeing positive in the fact that this current president, whether you like him or whether you don't like him, is really the first leader that has consistently pointed out that P3s are something that the country should be looking at?
Yeah, it's been mixed. He admittedly, yes, he started with P3s. At one point, he didn't like it so much, but the vice president was governor over some of the largest P3s in the country, and so there's certainly expertise there. We've had many meetings within the U.S. Department of Transportation. There's an office called the Build America Bureau, which, if you're familiar with TIFIA, which is a loan program for federal, the RIF loans, if you deal with the railroads, a lot of loan programs have all come under that bureau. And it is now time for that bureau, in my opinion, and I don't lobby, not ready, but educate, that that bureau needs to do more to come to places like Kansas and help do that. Not in as I joke, not in I'm from Washington, I'm here to help. But I'm from Washington, and here are a lot of advisors we hired for you to use for free, and we're going to make this work. So there's a lot more going on there. And of course, at EPA with WIFIA, which please start using WIFIA. That's the great thing in the federal level of Congress. If you don't use the money, they tend to take it back. Just not as good. So how can we? And if anyone's at, how can WIFIA, if you know, how can it be better?
I'm not going to point them out, but there are several representatives in this room that just successfully landed some good funding in that area.
Fantastic.
So again, we're really pleased about that. Well, I have about 2 more minutes to wrap up.
Yeah.
And then I'd like other questions, comments from the audience.
All right. So just 2 more. Value for money. If you nothing else, the speakers are. It's all about value for money, which sounds kind of wonky, but You don't do a P3 project unless it's going to be better. So there's two things. Either you are going to do an analysis, and there's plenty of financial advisors. I used to be one. Again, I'm sorry. Who will do these models for you. They're expensive, but they're important. You want to look at what would it cost the public, the government, to do this project under their traditional means themselves, so they don't do it. And then maintain it, the real cost of ownership. What would that cost? You then go to all the people bidding on your project, the private teams, the SPV, and say, all right, this is what it would cost for us to do it. Do better. Give me, the government, a better value for money. And that can come in two forms. Either they look at it, and in this model, it costs less money. So you get whatever it is you're buying under the traditional means, but you get it for less under the P3, or your cost of ownership is less. The other way that can happen is always a delegate conversation with elected officials. The private sector comes back and it's even or it's more. Which you're like, oh my goodness, why would it's going to cost more? But you get so much more. So there's always a chance the private sector is going to say, instead of this project costing $100 million, it's going to cost $105 million, but I'm going to get you $20 million more in value. Or that asset's going to last another 20 years. The example is always, if you look at what kind of flooring are you going to put in a building, you can put in really cheap flooring. It's going to be hard to maintain, expensive, you're going to have to replace it every 2 years. Or you put in something better, and it'll be there much longer. That's all that cost-benefit analysis. So value for money is the big thing. I won't bore you with the procurement process, but this just highlights the difference between your traditional procurement and other. We take out only a few steps. You have the industry-grade RFI, you have the RFQ. You spend a lot more time on qualifications under a P3 than you do traditionally because you're looking at a whole team. Again, it's a marriage. So you're looking at the person you're going to be married to for the next 30, 40 years. And then you go out of the RFP. Once you get to the RFP phase under a P3, it actually takes a little less time because you know all the players. You've actually been able to talk to them, which is a little bit different sometimes. And then you come up with whatever it agrees on. So at that end, you're really looking at who's going to give me the best value for money. Advisory, I made fun of my advisory friends long enough, but really, they are important. If you're going to do this, get the right advisors, legal, financial, technical advisors. If any of you are in the room, P3s are great. It's a good business. Yeah, technical advisors, a lot of engineers, they have helped me immensely. I think we covered all this. Thank you. We covered a lot of this already. Payment mechanism, again, I mentioned this, the availability payment. It just takes in the O&M costs, life cycle costs, debt service, equity, the equity folks, and any kind of deductions. Hopefully you don't have any. That is the payment, monthly, quarterly, annually, that the government makes to the private sector. And this is for an availability payment deal. So this is something that there's no ratepayers. This works really well for buildings, something the government's going to own. All right, and this is the real thing. If you are interested or have questions, let me know. Like I said, I was a government employee for 3 years. I was always private sector. I always said I'd only work for the government if I got appointed. Be careful what you wish for. I got appointed, and we were joking. I lived in Maryland. My wife is very kind. She let us move into the district, sell our house, buy a house, move into the district. It's been great. But I was on both sides of that, and now I get to be the fun nonprofit guy doing great events like this. But AIAI and personally, we're just here to help you. So if you have questions about P3s, love them or hate them, or anything, let me know. We're here to help you, the P3 community, the infrastructure community, to do better. Because if not, we're all in a lot of trouble. I don't want to have to move to Canada. It's really cold. Thank you.
Question?